is a great pleasure to introduce the main Catalan event at the Sant Jordi Festival of Books and Roses. I think I'd like to tell you a little bit about the festival, Sant Jordi NYC in France. Well, people have been celebrating Sant Jordi for 100 years. The Catalan, what it used to be called the Nationalist Center of Catalonia in 2023, which then became, I don't remember the intermediate name, and the Catalan Center. And then it became France of Catalonia after, in the 60s. And then in the 80s, I think, we Catalan student union. And there have always been Sant Jordis. Usually it would revolve around the Catalan community and, have a lot of children's events. And in 2014, in fact, Jaume Pillay was the president of the Catalan Institute of America, who is here today. And we decided that we wanted to open Sant Jordi beyond just the Catalan community. And because I'm a translator, I thought, let's make it let's celebrate the languages of the world, which is a way to celebrate Catalan as well, because it includes languages of any dimension, not just the big four. And so that's what we did. And the first Sant Jordi was a lit crawl through Dumbo from one bookstore to the next, and we were like Pied Pipers of Hamelin. We read Polish in the first bookstore, Czech in the second, Argentine literature and Mozambican literature in the third, and the fourth was the big Catalan party with music. So it worked. And we have been fortunate that the Sant Jordi Festival has become something that other languages also look forward to. So we were successful in making it because Sant Jordi isn't only about Catalan literature in Catalonia either. It's all about the literatures, all the books that are being sold there, many of which are translated from other languages. So in 2020, we were ready to do 5 lit crawls, and COVID shut us down. And so we went online, and then we discovered our online audience. And that has been a boon, and people from all over the world actually participate in the event. So the novelty this year, the new thing this year, is that after 10 years of working in theaters and cultural centers, we approached the West Village Business Improvement District, and they have decided to host us to do a street event. So finally we're going to be able to replicate on a small scale the Sant Jordi Festival of Books and Roses. But I have some bad news. There's a 90% chance of rain on Saturday.
Yes.
And so we are postponing the book fair. We're at the time, we're postponing it. So Sant Jordi is taking a detour. He's kind of arriving via Canada, I think. But anyway, May 17th is the new day.
Oh,
Okay, so mark your calendars. That will give us more time to I don't know, get people involved and all of that. But I'm very sorry about that. But the fact is, we're going to close down Christopher Street. We're going to have a stage. We're going to have music and performances and all of that. It's still going to go on, but it's going to happen on May 17th. So, but now this is a very important event. Ara will tell you why April 24th is a particularly significant day. And April 23rd was yesterday, so it was St. George's Day. And we're going to start the conversation with Aram's notebook, which was published by Swan Isle Press, which is an imprint of University of Chicago Press. And Ara Merjian is a professor of Italian at New York University, and he has translated this from Catalan. What was the book I worked
El
on?
Futurisme by Alomar, Gabriela.
Gabriela Alomar.
Oh,
Yeah.
Gabriela Loma. Did you translate that?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
So, but this is a sideline for Ara because he's a
I did
professor of
brief
Italian at
research
New York
on
University.
Gabriel Omar.
And Aurélie Vialette is a professor of global Iberian studies, but in particular Catalan studies at Yale University. And they are going to talk about Maria Àngels Anglada was a Catalan novelist. She's best known for her novel The Violin of Auschwitz, which was translated by whom? Do you remember?
In English, I'm not certain, but that one has been translated into like a dozen or 14 languages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the book she's most well known for, but this you'll see why she has continued a kind of righteous path with Aram's notebook.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here,
Thank
and
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to first start by acknowledging and thanking Marianne for her hard work over the years in promoting Catalan culture abroad, and particularly in the United States, and in the past generously helping, for example, with that translation of Gabriel Alomar, and obviously someone to whom we're all really, all of us interested in Catalan studies are indebted for a continued presence, and also having Jordana here, one of my dear old friends, and someone who helped transmit to me her love of Catalan culture and language many now decades ago, scarcely enough. So yes, as it turns out, the sort of I don't know if it's a felicitous confluence, but the fact that Sant Jordi is one day before April 24th, or as we call it, Abril que Sant Jordi in Armenian, which is the yearly anniversary of the Armenian genocide. This is now the 110th anniversary. It began in. Do you want us to, or can you hear us, or?
Do you need? It's here. The mic is here.
Oh,
no, those mics.
Okay,
Oh.
you can use this one. Is that better? Yeah.
it's a
little better, sure.
Because there's an echo with the room.
Okay. So it marks the day on which the essentially last gasp of the Ottoman Empire began rounding up Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul, marking what became the start of a multi-year campaign to exterminate the Armenian minority in Anatolia, which was a Christian population in the midst of what was eventually planned to be a pan-Turkic territory from which the Armenian Christian minority was to be removed through systematic extermination. So it was the first genocide of the 20th century. And in addition to the fact of the genocide, of which my four grandparents were actually survivors and made it to the United States through various ports of call. And so my own interest in languages is also inspired by them. My grandmother spoke one grandmother spoke 7 languages without an accent. So it's sort of the fruit of diasporic peoples, I suppose. But in addition to the genocide, the injury of the genocide has been the ongoing insult of the lack of recognition by the government that succeeded the Ottoman Empire, which is, of course, that of modern-day Turkey, founded by Kemal Atatürk, who in some instances continued the expulsion of various minorities from what became Turkey, including Greeks and Jews from Smyrna and other cities. The vagaries of the recognition of the genocide have been many and numerous and taking all sorts of strange paths. Joe Biden became the first president in 2021 to officially recognize the Armenian genocide. That precedent was, like many others, torn up today when Donald Trump, in his official presidential announcement, failed to use the word genocide, instead using the Armenian term for it and couching it in a series of relative euphemisms. So the sort of battle for the recognition of the genocide continues, and it is one that really kind of, in some ways, anchors our understanding of what became in the 20th century, as Samantha Power has called it, a problem from hell, which is the repeated use of genocide in sites all over the globe, and something that, of course, continues to this day. So, in terms of just briefly the novel and its translation, that was an incredibly felicitous thing. I was at the beginning of grad school, thought I was going to be doing my doctoral work on the Catalan avant-garde. So I went in my first summer as a grad student at Berkeley to Barcelona for the summer to Drassanes to take a class in Catalan. And my teacher said, "Oh my God, your name's Ara, you're Armenian. There is this Catalan author named Marian Anglada who has written this novel on the Armenian genocide." And I said, "Are you sure?" I'm certain. And I bought it, and it was, back then it appeared in what was called the Columna Jova, which is basically sort of the young people's literature for young adults. But it was not in some ways a kind of fluke or aberration, not only in Anglada's corpus, as Marianne rightfully said just a few minutes ago, but it has had some staying power in Catalonia. I was on the train to Sitges about 5 years ago, and there was a young woman reading it, and this was a good 15 years after I had first encountered it, and I asked her about it, and she said that it was actually required reading at her high school in Tarragona or something like that. So it has had some staying power. And it is a novel that, as Marianne mentioned, kind of adds to a corpus of literature by Maria Àngels Anglada, which has concerned itself with minoritarian communities, minoritarian cultures. She was not only an intellectual who read in various languages, including French, which is, interestingly enough, how she first encountered the poetry of Daniel Varoujan, who is the Armenian poet, who was murdered at the start of the Armenian genocide, who forms the model for the fictive character of Vahe in the novel. And she first discovered his poetry in a translation of Varoujan's poems, which appeared in a journal in her native. Actually, no, she was born in Vic, but this appeared in Reus, in a publication published in Reus of Armenian literature translated into French. And, she had already written this novel on the Holocaust, which was well received, widely translated, and turned her attention to researching the Armenian genocide, because this is a historical novel. She dedicated herself to reading various kinds of histories, in addition to familiarizing herself with it through specific individuals. Actually, the Maria Ohanisian, who appears at the start of the novel, who gives her the fictional notebook, is actually a professor at the University of Barcelona, and she is a Catalan woman of Armenian descent, and she became friends with Anglada over the years, and sort of helping furnish her various literature and scholarship on the genocide. The book is also equipped with a timeline at the end, which she wrote, and interestingly, in addition to all of the sort of various pre- and proto-historic information about Armenia, when you get to the Middle Ages, she is very careful to point out that the kingdom of Cilicia, which was an Armenian kingdom called Minor Armenia on the Mediterranean, which was a sort of golden age of medieval Armenian trade, literature, culture, that it enjoyed very strong relations with Catalonia, and that Ramon Llull had gone in the 14th century, and that in addition, King Leo IV, the last king of Cilician Armenia, married Princess Constance of Sicily, who was a Catalan princess. So she had clearly done her sort of historical research, and so this sort of bond, in a sense, between between this history of a diasporic peoples and a people upon whom had been visited numerous tragedies, resonated for her as a humanitarian and someone interested in human rights. So I have tons to say, but I know I'm excited to hear what Aurélie has to say, and then of course we'll take questions.
Yeah, wonderful. You already answered two of my first points
Okay.
with your introduction
Okay.
about how you came to this book, how you got interested in this book, and also how a Catalan woman writer like Marianne Anglada would be interested in addressing such a topic, right? And you talk in the introduction about the committed author that she is. I'm going to read from what you say and then move on to the next topic then. But you said, Anglada had always proven to be what might be called a committed author. Her writing takes up a number of different but interrelated threads: human and civil rights, the protection of minoritarian cultures and languages, the rights of women, and the preservation of memory in the wake of genocide and diaspora. In addition to the salient characteristic of her prose and poetry, this sense of moral rectitude made Àngels Anglada one of the most prominent figures of late 20th century Catalan letters. And here in this book, she does it, this book is a diary, right? So the genre of the diary is really interesting for the topic that she addresses, right? So I wanted to know if you can talk about how it is to translate a diary, because it's very specific, right? I guess for a translator, because there's a voice, and then we'll talk about the narrators and the voice later. I have a question regarding that, but also what does it offer for a topic like a family or an entire national group fleeing war and genocide, right? Why a diary, and how to translate a diary on this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, she was in a sense tackling, she was scaling a very tall mountain, right? Because when you think about the Holocaust and diaries, of course, the precedence of Anne Frank looms very large. And the fact that this is a fictional novel and not an actual diary kind of incurs questions as to things which she ends up tackling head on, which is what is fiction's role in attesting genocide, right? This is something that I talk a little bit about in the introduction, which is something that scholars have started to work on very assiduously, particularly Saidiya Hartman, who teaches at Columbia, working on what she calls essentially speculative histories, which is recreating the voices of individuals who at the time didn't have access to ways to record their voices and their narratives. And in a sense, I think in a looser sense, that's kind of what she's doing, is kind of giving back that voice to someone who did not necessarily have the resources.
Yeah, she's taking historical characters, a real poet, and his death, and the way, she has documentation for that.
Yes.
Because one of the two narrations that we get are transcripts of, two declarations, right? And one of them is the real declaration.
So
from
there's
someone.
a mix of historical
and then she reproduces some, as well when historical facts happen. She reproduces that. So she's done a historical research, and I liked that you talked about critical fabulation a little bit in the introduction. After reading the book, of course, I read your introduction and I hadn't read the book, but now that I think of it, it's really avant la lettre, right?
I'm glad that was helpful.
I wonder if you could tell us sort of the elevator speech of what the novel's about?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want...
Sure, yeah. It's essentially about a young boy who's I think about 10 when it starts out, or 11, 9. Okay. When at the start of the genocide, living near Van, in or near Van, which is a historically Armenian city, which is now part of modern day Turkey, but which at the time was a historical Armenian community on Lake Van. And their family, like many others, is displaced. They are essentially set on a march of exile, during which they experience various depredations, attacks by kind of marauding Kurdish bandits, and harassment by various Turkish officials. And the sort of very accelerated version is that they eventually are able to, he and his mother, not having any news of their father.
And the sisters, and actually they were going in a pilgrimage, right?
Yes,
And they ended up
exactly, yeah.
having to flee.
Yeah.
So they left.
It caught them sort
Yeah,
of completely
by
unaware.
surprise, yes.
They eventually are able to flee, and through various ports of call, including Marseille, end up settling in Catalonia, in
Yeah, we don't.
right?
Yeah, we don't really get that. And
Yeah,
we know that, but it's really.
It's left a little bit, but they basically have a sort of trip of exile across the Mediterranean, and they end up in Marseille meeting a Greek family who helps them, along with various humanitarian, like real humanitarian agencies which existed. And Aram ends up marrying the sister of this young Greek boy who becomes his friend and who is a coral fisherman. And Aram eventually becomes an apprentice to this group of coral fishermen and basically ends up, settling basically in Catalonia. And as it turns out, the cover of the novel, as you can tell, has this this individual covered in this. What was then a pretty cutting-edge diving suit.
Yeah.
And it's actually a real photograph.
A real photo taken in Caracas, right?
It's taken in Cadaqués of this family, the Contos family, who had left the Dodecanese Greek island of Simi and migrated to Catalonia in 1917. And this is from their family archive. So the Contos family that is featured in the novel is actually based on a real family.
Yes.
From Cadaqués. So again, even that element is based on actual sort of historical sources. And so that was another way also for Maria Angels to sort of to link the Armenian narrative to a Catalan one. And one of the things, the way the novel starts out, just as sort of a kind of metaphor of that, is she sees one day she had been on vacation in Rhodes in the Dodecanese and saw the local lizard, the agamastellio it's called, which is native to the island. And back in Catalonia, I think it's a few years later, she sees another one of these lizards, which is not native to Catalonia. So she says, like, how is it that this lizard has, suddenly appeared, this species which is not native to this land? And so in some ways it's kind of metaphor of displacement and also of that same journey in a sense. So that's basically the sort of nutshell.
Yeah, and the novel is very moving. I mean, I was telling you that I was extremely moved while I was reading this text because, first of all, we get a first-person narration of an event that is extremely traumatizing, but also it's a child's diary, right? The father gave this diary to his son because the son had been very sick, and so he was going to a pilgrimage with his mother, and that's when they encounter, that they had to leave and that they weren't prepared to leave. But so he has the diary, and instead of describing what he sees during his pilgrimage, he describes the displacement and the feeling that they experience throughout this journey that is basically, trying to avoid death. And it's, of course, they don't have anything to eat. He describes people dying on the road, a mother dying with a baby, and he takes a baby, and he's maybe 9 or 10, right, when he writes that. So he's very young, and he says, that day I became, I was not a child anymore. So that's these eyes, we see through his narration something that later was going to be described as a genocide, right? So that's extremely moving. And I want to address two things, that really were interesting to me. I have many notes. One of them is the question of the lost manuscript, right? Because Anglada is using the literary trope of the lost manuscript, like Don Quixote or many other contemporaries of hers, right? I found this manuscript. So what does it give to the novel? Like, it's a lost manuscript and it's a diary. But also what is fascinating in this quote-unquote lost manuscript is the shift of narrators that I mentioned before. So we have first Aram's narration, then we go to his mother, and then to Aram's narration transcribed by his mother, and then to, I think, the author herself, who's finishing the story with some archive that she found.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we have the lost manuscript, which is a fiction,
Yeah,
but
which says like someone brought me this diary of a boy who fled, and oh, okay.
But on the other, we have the many narratives instances that it's really a unique approach to the topic and to looking at a family, displaced because of war.
Yeah.
Why this multiple approach?
I know. I remember when I first read it, I was confused. Like, did this actually, was this diary actually real? Because Maria Ohanesian is real. So did she actually give you? And I think, in a sense, she plays purposefully with those registers of reality and fiction. I mean, both. Because then you think, okay, this is not real. But then, in fact, everything from the Kontos clan to the reports of Daniel Varujan's death to dispatches from the press, which she incorporates, are real.
Yes.
So there's this mix of reality and fiction, which essentially, in some ways also perhaps alludes obliquely to the question of doubt about the genocide, right? About its who decides essentially what is truthful.
Yeah, and it's the archive of the war and the exiled and the it's dispersed, right? I mean, they had to flee, they had nothing, and all of a sudden there's this diary, but it also is something subjective because it's a little boy's narration. And the loss of innocence, right? So there's like a mix of this fiction and historical fact and the archive that she used to write this book. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned she discovered Armenian poetry via translation. And now you are translating this Armenian story yourself into English that she wrote in Catalan, right? So here there's also, like a projection. I mean, I don't know.
There are various sort of what we would call sort of intertextual moments where the father is based on Daniel Varujan, but she names him Vahe, and Vahe was the name of the French translator who translated Varujan's poems from Armenian into French. So there's a kind of intertextual sort of play. But one thing I was going to say, and I'm really glad you brought up the question of sort of narrator and voice and truth and fiction. I mean, because of the perennial denial of the Armenian genocide ongoing by the Turkish government and the sort of open wound that represents for the Armenian community, some attempts at fictional narratives of the genocide, like an author named Micheline Aharonian Marcom, who wrote a beautiful novel around 2000 called Three Apples Fell from Heaven, one of a trilogy of novels on the Armenian genocide. And some in the Armenian community were critical of the use of fiction in sort of narrating and dealing with the genocide. Why? In part, I think because there is a sense that because it is something that is already called into question, is already doubted, that fear feels on behalf of the community that there has to be an attention on sort of proof and empiricism, and that anything that detracts from that drive is kind of exacerbates the question of doubt, right? Because fiction is about doubt in a certain sense. The way she plays with the different narrative registers. Yes, at one point, the mother says, I'm taking, Aram is off fishing and working, he doesn't have time, I'm taking over narrating. And then, as Aurélie said, at one point, the actual sort of narrator comes back, but the beginning of the novel is also started seemingly by Anglada herself. There's all these different registers of voice.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating. We have a video that Marian, Newman, and I want to thank you because we started the conversation currently, but I'm very, very glad that you invited me to the conversation for this book, the translation of this book. Marian Newman received a video from Ambassador Arturo Sarkan, and we wanted to play the video.
You're probably asking why Mexican, the former Mexican ambassador to the US, is participating in this book presentation. You see, Aram's notebook by Marialena Carr is not only a fantastic book, but it's in many ways a chronicle that echoes, that reverberates through my own life and through the experiences of both of my maternal and paternal families. You see, I'm the son and grandson of refugees, conflict refugees in Mexico. On my father's side, Armenian refugees who survived the genocide, who fled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. On my mother's side, Spanish Republicans from Barcelona, Catalans who fled when Barcelona finally collapsed to Franco's fascism and invading armies and crossed the Pyrenees into France, and then were given asylum by the Mexican government. As you can very quickly ascertain, the fact that this is a book precisely about Aram's own travails in surviving the horrors of the first genocide of the 20th century, crossing a Mediterranean that also connects both my families, because on my mother's side, living in Barcelona, being Catalans in the Mediterranean, has always formed a part of their lives. It forms a part of my life today, as I go back and forth to visit family and friends there. But the Mediterranean was also what allowed, like Aram, my Armenian family, particularly my grandmother, to survive. It was the generous Mediterranean. It was two Greek fishermen who were able to take my grandmother, who had survived the first phases of the genocide in 1915, just like Aram, to Thessalonica, from Thessalonica to Venice, where she met my Armenian Russian grandfather who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution. He was on the losing side, also with the Bolsheviks, and having been trained at the Armenian seminar in Venice, he had gone back to Venice, my grandparents being in Venice, and then when Mussolini comes to power, my grandfather says, I've seen that story before, let's get the hell out of here before this blows. So, in many ways, that Mediterranean, which is the connective tissue of this story, of Aram's life and story, is also the connective tissue of my family, of my connections, the sea that was generous enough to see both Catalans and Armenians remake lives across another ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, in Mexico in the 1930s. And at the end of the day, this book, and this is why I was so sorry I could not be there to join in the presentation and celebration of this book. It is a story of human connections, it is a story of survival, it is a story of remembrance, and it is precisely the remembrance that allows us to stand today in the 21st century and shout out loud, never again. And I hope that this book once again rekindles precisely the day that we commemorate the remembrance of the Armenian genocide, one day after the Vialette Sant Jordi, a very important Catalan festivity, this connective tissue that binds us, but that also allows us to shout out loud, we are here, you did not defeat us, you did not destroy us, you did not eradicate us from this world. And I think that this beautiful little novel precisely does that.
Well, there's many things to pick up in that video from the ambassador. First, so many family histories, so many family experiences that are close to what the book talks about. I mean, it's about something very specific, but many can just, really connect to this book. There's the role of the Mediterranean. It's very much a Mediterranean novel, and maybe we can address that then also. And, he talks about a story of survival, of remembrance, but it's also a story of solidarity among people. I think that's really important to mention, because the journey that Aram and his mother undertake, throughout the journey, they meet people, and they're all, there's this solidarity among them that is absolutely moving. We can all connect to this book. And it was moving for me as well, for a very different history. But my grandma wrote her memoirs, telling us the story of my grandpa's imprisonment in a war camp in Nazi Germany for almost 5 years. And she started to write that when she was almost 80, I think, and it's a story that he never told because I don't remember. He didn't want to talk about it. So we accessed the story through a memoir. I mean, it was not a diary, but it was very much something like that, about, trying to tell things that, she had listened to, and that's all. She was the repository of that. So I think it's a book that you would say, well, it's weird that she wrote on the Armenian genocide, but she's creating a sort of, universal feeling around it that we can all really connect to in one way or another. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of when I was in college, I started interviewing survivors of the Armenian genocide because they were, it was obviously started in 1915 and this was around 1997. So, many of them these were people in old age homes whose years were very numbered. And it's interesting that what you say about your grandfather sort of not remembering, it's incredibly interesting that the differences in some people's kind of will to remember or will to forget, and how what you do with that memory, right? Do you pursue it at the expense of the other person, feeling pain again, or, can that memory also fall to others, like your grandmother, who is also, in a sense, a kind of witness in a second degree? But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a kind of, and these different ports of call are very interesting as well, because, his family's history in Thessaloniki, which was a city also of many Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain after the Inquisition, but is also subsequently became a site of many Armenian refugees after the genocide. My own grandmother she was in Smyrna with her sister when the Turks burned the Armenian and Greek and Jewish quarters, and she was saved by a Greek sailor, actually. And she spent 7 years in the YWCA in Athens. So my grandmother spoke Greek, in addition to eventually very poor English. They all had super strong Armenian accents, but they were all New Yorkers. They lived in Queens, and they considered themselves New Yorkers, which is something I believe. I always think about that when they sort of try to tell us what America is or isn't, like, and I always think about, what is a New Yorker, what is an American? I mean, these people had been through hell, and they considered themselves New Yorkers, as much as anything else. But yeah, so as you said, it is a very kind of, and that Mediterraneanness attests a lot to, another grandmother actually who was sent on one of the death marches into Syria, was eventually adopted / became part of the harem of Bedouins in the desert, and she actually bore the tattoos of the tribe until her death. But she eventually spent 6 months in Marseille, which is another port of call in the book. So you're right. I mean, it speaks to different kinds of crossings and histories and families, despite its seeming kind of specificity.
Well, you said you interviewed, and that was kind of maybe the closing remarks, or because we have
open it up.
No, but I wanted to say another questions and let people have a look.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
But I can finish the last point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because you said you interviewed people. And one of the questions I wanted to ask last was about your research. I mean, of course, you translate the book, but you don't just translate the book. I mean, Marianne could explain it better than myself, right? It's when you translate a book, you need to do so much research around the book, around the author, around what the book is telling you. I mean, what kind of research and the specific research you undertook to translate, to being able to translate this book?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in a sense, it really was a kind of labor of love, because at that point I had sort of, I had migrated from Catalan studies into Italian studies and kept doing it out of my love for Catalan language and culture and friends. but also really, I guess, drawing upon my still relatively limited knowledge of the Armenian genocide and its history, and reading the Violin of Auschwitz, reading trying to find the Varoujan poems translated into French. You're right. I mean, it becomes a kind of archaeology of how the author herself arrived at the book, trying in a sense to kind of reconstruct how she came up with this narrative. Her daughters are still alive. I regret that unfortunately she was no longer with us when I started work on the translation, but it's clear that she is still a beloved figure in Catalan letters. There's a university chair in her name. There are special issues of journals dedicated to her work. So I suppose the research was basically just trying to sort of reconstruct how she arrived at the narrative that she did. Yeah.
So maybe we can open up the floor, and if someone has questions, I can give the mic.
So, the point you were mentioning as a translator, it's a lot of work and engagement, and probably for you very personal, being that you're a descendant. So I understand it's a fiction, and as a translator, having your knowledge from your ancestors of what happened, I was just wondering, was there anything in her book that you disagreed with, or that you felt was not maybe so accurate, or that you discovered and maybe shared with your relatives?
That's a good question. I don't think there were any moments where I thought. I mean, there's some of the parts of the book which I think are sort of helpful. Is that Anglada, in a sense, kind of shares her discovery of Armenian culture as she's writing, and for an Armenian, some of it is sort of stuff that seems very obvious, but she would kind of describe different kinds of food or cultural practices that were her way of kind of sharing what she had learned. And so it was not something I disagree with per se, or by any extent. It was more just sort of like acknowledging that these were things kind of along the way that she was sharing with the reader to help kind of understand Armenian culture. And that's why I did this glossary at the back of different phrases that she that appear in the book. I mean, if anything, her descriptions, her evocations of the horrors visited upon the families as they flee were precisely the kinds of things that I grew up hearing. I mean, it was clear that she had availed herself of different survivors' testimonies. I mean, there were just absolutely horrible things, from people being locked in churches and churches burned, to pregnant mothers being, eviscerated, like every horror you can imagine. So, in that instance, it was more just sort of a curiosity, I guess, as to how she came upon this narrative, and the way that it, I guess for me, the fact that, when I saw the photos of the Kontos family, it was just so magical in a sense to see that this was a real story. These were real people that she somehow threaded together. And that was, and so there was, as much as it's a painful topic, the other thing I should mention is this is one of only 4, as far as I know, novels on the Armenian genocide written by non-Armenians. There are dozens written by Armenians, but there are only 4, and this is the first work of Catalan literature to be translated into Armenian. And when it was, there was a reception and a big sort of ceremony in Yerevan in Armenia, and Anglada will enter into what do the Jews call it, the righteous Gentiles, right? The annals of righteous Gentiles. And so there's just this amazing sense of, there are, I would imagine, dozens, if not hundreds, of novels on the Holocaust, even by non-Jews, right? Interestingly enough, one of the others who wrote a novel on the genocide, Elsar Hilsenrath, an amazing Jewish German writer who won the Dublin Prize for his book. It's called the Story of the Last Sigh. And Franz Werfel, who was the German Austrian author. Yeah, sorry, Jewish Austrian expressionist writer who wrote 40 Days of Musa Dal. Oh, there you go. Yes. And my father, one of my brother's close friends in university was Werfel's great grandson. Which, when my father found out, he like completely freaked out because, again, righteous Gentile, like you find them, and so yeah. I'm sorry, I've sort of gone off on a tangent, but yeah, not that many novels on this topic by non-Armenians, and I think that just as when I was recommended it by this Catalan teacher, there was just this sense of it's moving because we're a small nation with a horrible history, but for someone to not just be interested in that history, but to kind of immerse herself in it to the extent to be moved to write something that took so much time and care is moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually have a question about that. Do you, how much do you think her Catalan sensibility contributed to this? And do you think there was some kind of intentionality about creating a Mediterranean narrative?
I think there was. I do. I think, that was one of her kind of, her ways to identify with the story and to sort of literally link it through this sort of travel across the Mediterranean she also, they briefly stopped in Italy, in Bari, where there is actually a historical Armenian community that fled the genocide. Also, Daniel Varujan was educated at San Lazzaro in Venice, which the ambassador mentioned, which is a historical, it's an island owned by Armenia in the lagoon of Venice, which holds a very ancient Mechitarist seminary since I can't remember which century. So they basically passed from Greece to Italy, to France, to Catalonia. So I think in a sense, that was kind of her way of making it hers in a certain sense. What was the first question again about?
Does her being Catalan have something to do with
Oh, yeah. I can't help but mention that when the press was gathering the blurbs on the back, that Joan Ramon Resinas was originally much more forceful than it is now, which was essentially, and this won't be a surprise to some in the room, it was like, well, of course Maria Angels has written a novel on the genocide because she knows what it is to have a people essentially try to be obliterated. It was a little bit over the top, but it also attested to a sense of, again, the threat of minoritarian culture as its own form of kind of elimination. And I think that that absolutely resonated with her in terms of, and we see this repeatedly, right? That genocide it never just entails the elimination of bodies. It also entails the elimination of language, of archaeological sites, of cultural nodes of connection. Especially as someone of her generation, having lived through the Francoist suppression of Catalan language and literature, that was something that was very real for her. So, absolutely, I think those are both great questions.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned already about how the diary is shared, right?
Yeah.
That some of it is written by Aram, some of it by his mother. So a very academic question, I guess, which is that how do you approach the kind of gendering of voice? I don't want to get too weird, but I just kept thinking as I was reading it, as authors do, but in writing this, Marianne doesn't inhabits multiple persons, and the writing of a young male voice, which she does very well, but it's not your personhood. Although youth is something that
Right.
folks travel through. And then also inhabiting the voice of the mother, and the mother in Aram's notebook comments a lot about her son.
Yeah.
That, oh, he stopped writing it, he's now doing this, he's doing that. There's a lot of editorializing about
Yeah.
her kind
Yeah.
of mothering of him and kind of observing his independence, and then it gets back into his hands. And, you know,
That's true.
How do you kind of track that forward? Because it's not that she's just writing this fictional character, it's that, again, the character changes gender and also age, right?
Right.
So it's a young boy, and then it's an older mother.
Yeah.
And those are very different subject positions to inhabit as an author.
Mm.
And I was captivated by all of those voices. But
Yeah.
I guess if you be a translator too, like
Yeah.
you occupy a certain subject position as a translator. If Aurélie was to translate that, she might translate it very differently, right? In terms of like who you are also as a translator, identifying with the different voices in the novel.
Well, as the mother of a teenage son, you might think also like maybe it's a little not realistic that a teenage boy would allow his mom to read his diary, right? But in a sense, it becomes. But in a sense, it becomes their. Yeah.
That gives it to her, which also gives her privy to his narration, his thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about it, but it's a good question of like, I mean, especially in the context now. I mean, I'm sure you have all sort of, increasingly there's a sense of, can an actor only be called to play a certain ethnicity or gender? Or, when Helen Mirren recently played Golda Meir in that biopic, there was an outrage, right? Because she wasn't Jewish. Like, in a sense, from my point of view, cinema and literature are those spaces in which someone can, precisely because of the act of a kind of empathetic embodiment, precisely attempt to inhabit another voice. And I think she kind of does it well. Like, I never get a sense that.
So one thing that, it's a great question, very difficult.
Yeah.
But one thing that that I marked here is when Aram talks about how the diary, like the notebook, changed function, because he refers halfway to the novel about his father giving him the notebook to note, to become a travel notebook. And he says, but instead of travel notes, it's become a memoir about mostly the misfortunes of our people, right? So he converts the diary, the diary was supposed to be his personal notes about a travel, and then it becomes the repository of the story of a collective, right? It's a collectivity. It's our misfortune, our trip, and it's his mother and himself, but actually it's just much more than that. So maybe what she wanted to say, I don't know, trying to interpret what you point out, which is really interesting, between, a young voice and an older voice, and two different, like a little boy and a mother. There's this story of a people, and then I think the fact that it's a boy, like a mother and a son, there's this care, right, that you were talking about in the novel. So that creates this multiplicity of voices that care for each other, that goes with the story of the displacement and solidarity of the people throughout the journey. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, the play in, the I, the our.
It is just interesting to think about what it means for an author to suddenly change genders, right? Or to, that's obviously a very sensitive subject these days, but I still believe that literature can be that space in which you can attempt to inhabit, or at least pretend, in a sense, especially if that pretending is one of empathy and sort of connection.
And thinking from psychology of teenage boys, it also makes sense that he would just sort of stop writing.
That too. There's a real kind of realism in that, where she's like, he's too busy,
He stops writing when he starts building his life, right? Building his profession and
Right.
and finding a life.
And finding a wife,
Yeah.
And also because his story is now his.
Yes.
It's no longer the collective, he's
Yes.
done his part.
Yes, yes.
Maybe.
Maybe,
I haven't
yeah,
read it
yeah.
yet. I want to read it, you guys.
But yeah, that's right.
But that's the thing, that
Yeah.
it is very much,
Like a Bildungsroman, roman, yeah.
It is a
This
business
is
roman.
how
Yeah,
you
yeah.
have that woman, and I
Totally.
love working with Coral.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
And his mom.
absolutely.
Bigger story.
Yeah.
And
Well, thank you.
It's a nice segue.
Yeah, to transition
Awesome.
to this.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. That was so great. That was awesome.
Congratulations for me is to talk a little bit about two women Catalan authors and their two women translators that I'm joined by here today. I'll very briefly introduce myself first. My name is Stephanie. I am a part of the editorial team at The Common magazine. I'd actually be very happy to send this around in a very class-like way for folks to take a look if they want. I would like to extend a very warm thank you to Marianne for inviting The Common to be here today and sharing this with you. Just a bit of information about The Common. It was very lovingly described as an exquisite literary review. I sense that was probably your words. We are a magazine that publishes prose, poetry, and fiction online a few times a week and in print twice a year. And a really wonderful thing, we're just celebrating our 15th anniversary this year, which is a really big deal for magazines, for print magazines. We're really making it. We're based out of Amherst College, which is a really wonderful partnership and a big part of why we're able to still exist. But a really great part about the magazine is that of these biannual issues, one issue features a portfolio that is often linguistically or geographically focused. And we've run the gamut from Sudanese literature, South African, Moroccan, Jordanian. We had a Lusosphere issue, Puerto Rico. And this most recent issue is Catalan women writers. And that's something that the editorial team and our founder, Jen Acker, has held very close to heart and featured and felt was a necessary part of the magazine, is that it really is global literature. Our sort of tagline is that all of our pieces feature a very modern sense of place. Place can mean a lot of things. It can mean geography, it can mean spirituality, language, all sorts of things. So with that.
And how did you decide to do a dossier on Catalan women's literature?
That's actually a question that that Jen unfortunately is not here and I can't answer for us, but I think in their commissioning of pieces for the magazine, as they find pieces they really like, if they're not yet translated, they go out and find translators, and in that way, right, we sort of build this network. And it's a really wonderful magazine to be a part of. I feel very lucky to be here today, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
With that, I will really, the plan here is to let you introduce yourselves, read a bit from your text. One is incredibly short. I'm not even sure you'll be able to, no, it's yours, is the quite short one, sorry.
Mine is, but it's a 10-minute read. I don't need to read the whole thing. But if you,
It has such a delicious ending.
It has such a great ending. It's such a good
So
story.
read the ending, yeah.
I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable if you didn't get to the ending.
Yeah, no, I thought if I didn't read the whole thing, we'd have to do a spoiler.
Yeah, we would just be sad for this lady. It's like,
You're sad for the lady? Oh.
well, a little bit.
I'm sad for the lady, yeah.
Yeah, I am kind of sad for her.
Do you want to do your first intro?
Well, you'll see. Whether you feel sad for her or not. I do. Okay, I'm sorry. It's called Remembrances, so this is also a
speaking of.
segue with the other conversation. I must say the type is small.
Can I shine a light for you?
No, it's okay. Antònia Vicenç. She's Mallorcan, by the way. She writes in Catalan. I don't think most of you, well, all of you here know that Catalan is spoken in the Balearic Islands and in Valencia and in the south of France and in a little piece of Corsica. A language that spans 5 countries. Remembrances. One day he came, handed me a little box and said, look inside. Oh God, what a husband. I was afraid maybe he was losing it. Another day it had been, look, open this package, and there were more than a half dozen bras with ruffles. I opened the little box and was practically blinded by a stone brighter than the sun. No explanation, nothing. Business is coming along, he said. And at night, here we go, trying for an heir, but that wasn't coming along at all. If I was in love with my husband, it isn't something I would say too loud. When we were kids, he was already after me, pulling on my braids, tripping me, laughing when I cried. But the one I was in love with, like all the other girls my age who were starting to feel the tickling of forbidden things, like all the other women, married or widowed, barren, or mothers of many children, was the town vicar. A bit sickly, slight, almost transparent, he had us all under a spell. His gentle way of speaking, his graceful gestures, his dark, piercing gaze, so close to that soft smile, his lips like 2 slices of apple, pear, quince, any fleshy fruit. And better not to mention the 10 fingers of his hands. The men knew, of course they knew, and the worst thing was that he also knew. No woman drew near him without stretching out her hands for him to kiss them, and we, still tender little buds, ran over to rub our noses in his hands and our cheeks, and then he would give us a blessing. The boys, jealous and a little shy, would say, "Sure, I'm not as attractive as the vicar." And the husbands, pissed off, "Shit, I'm not as polite as the vicar." In the end, more or less everyone dined out on the vicar. Even my mother would say, "What a blossom of a man the vicar is." And my father, an anti-clerical Republican from way back, would come back with a ton of unrelenting shits and fucks. "You should all burn in hell." Another day, my husband came and stretched out both hands with his fists closed. "Guess, come on, which hand do you want?" A little hesitant, a little scared, I said, "This one," pointing to the right, and he burst out laughing and opened the left. A set of keys clinking before my eyes. A new house in the city, in a fine neighborhood as it happened, on a 4th floor overlooking the bay. At first I got lost with all the intersecting hallways separating bedrooms and little rooms. Little rooms, what is the bad translation of that? Everything decorated in the latest style. And a maid who served me lunch at the table, turned down the bed, cleaned the house. What can I say? I had the whole day to do nothing, get lost in thought. Now look out one window, now another. And at night, here he was, wanting to make a baby. An heir, because he said it must be very gratifying for a man to come home and find his wife and children waiting for him. Truth be told, I was hoping for a child too, but what was eating away at me was not knowing where that pit of money came from. And he said, "Well, don't bother about that. It's all legal. Housing developments, hotels, tourists." Occasionally, it would be, "I can't come home tonight, I won't be home for lunch," and I wandered up and down the hallways, bedecked in outlandish, expensive clothes meant for lounging at home, and even at home they looked ridiculous. But this is what he wanted, for me to look gorgeous for him if he found a minute to come home. I soon tired of this looking gorgeous for him, and his dissatisfaction began to spread through my body like a kind of hemorrhage, leaving me listless, pale. Some friends he had introduced me to, satisfied wives and grateful daughters of friends of his in the business, suggested I see a psychologist, since besides giving you pills that turn your sorrows into joys, it had cachet. It made you look rich. But I decided to go back to wearing my old clothes and to thinking about the vicar and wondering if he still went around stilling ladies' hearts and making bodies like mine go faint in the absence of a sensible, reliable husband. As I said, I was fed up with him, and I also made fun of him. At first he would go, "You aren't adapting. You're used to working and the good life is too much for you. You need a child, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, a house full of children." And colder than a block of ice, I would think, "Go on, fool. You're the thing that's too much for me. You and your pompous, inflated pronouncements full of shit." And while he applied body and soul to making a baby, I would fantasize about how one of his numerous secretaries would call me, "Mrs., is this you? I have been told to inform you that your husband has had a heart attack. He's all yellow and quite dead." I bundled up the fancy clothes and gave them to Rosario. "Señora, what an honor," she said in her Andalusian accent. And more than once my husband, on one of his hurried visits, either to change his clothes or to look for the pills for stress he had forgotten to take with him, gave Rosario a kiss and apologized. I made a mistake. It's your fault for making her wear your clothes. And I would shrug, and he would practically kneel before me. He didn't understand or didn't want to understand my indifference. You could see he still hoped to have a son, an heir, because what am I working for if not? And I knew very well what he was working for whatever whim blew out of his ass, as I was on the verge of telling him 1,000 times, I swear it on my health. For a whole string of debauched partners and employees, retired military men, cross-eyed civil guards, he worked for the rancid ass of them all, a bunch of cranks who would just as soon hire the most expensive floozies of the city as cry before the portrait of General Franco, because now, without the general, they were nobodies. And goodies that used to be only for them now trickled down to the people. And when it came to voting, they said no, they had all the freedom they wanted. And my husband, madder than I've ever seen him, saying, I will go from town to town, from district to district, present 1 million fake names. What is going on? People just like to complain. Everyone's out for themselves. In some moment of euphoria, I told him just like this, that things would not end well, that a business born of a lucky moment couldn't last a lifetime, that it would be like a sandcastle, and a bad gust of wind would bring it all down. But he didn't so much as listen. He paced up and down in his shiny silk dressing gown, Rosario running behind him with the ashtray, impressed by my husband's long, wide stride. Poor thing, always sighing, Ay, señora, I'm just dazzled by shiny things. One day, tired of doing nothing, my fantasies exhausted, remembering the vicar no longer made my heart beat, unable to come up with a single type of man who might come to save my femininity, I said to Rosario, lie down on the sofa or look out the window, enjoy the delights of the bay views, war vessels and merchant vessels, motorboats and fishing boats, the sea all blue and the sky all green. See how the clouds thin out and melt, turning into snowflakes. See how the wind buffets the atmosphere, leaving it bruised, how the mountains tremble, how the cars on the highway are getting flats, 4 accidents in 5 days, 10 deaths in a week. Watch closely, Rosario. Leave no page of the newspaper unread, sports and politics and culture to understand the ways of men. And I'll make lunch, Rosario, and wash the dishes and do the housekeeping. And Rosario said, what an honor, señora. More than a few times I confronted my husband. I wanted a divorce or a separation or whatever. Far from you, I'll be a different woman, healthy, happy. But he, if he was in a good mood, would laugh until his sides shook. My little lady is so funny. And if he was angry, he wouldn't listen. He would empty the bottle of Chivas Regal and quickly down a kilo of green almonds, almost without chewing. If I sat down next to him trying to clarify the situation a bit, his face would go red and puff up so much that I would feel uncomfortable and go up to the roof terrace and leave him to do as he pleased with Rosario, since the only thing that gave him pleasure was sexual release. And for quite some time now, I had decided that was not for me by any means. And he would say, why are you rejecting me? I sensed that the business wasn't going as well as before, when in moments of depression, instead of hitting the Scotch whiskey, he would soak up national brands that he wouldn't even have sniffed before. He also stayed home more, wanting to tell me something. Despite it all, he never managed to say anything, but I understood. Of course I understood, as much as I hated him. One Sunday afternoon, as he leaned over the railing on the roof terrace, moving his fingers, moving his hands, moving his whole body as if his bones were decomposing, it wasn't hard at all, and it wasn't even much of a physical effort. I couldn't quite get what he wanted, what he shouted as he fell. The lights had just gone on in the bay. The setting sun had left a sort of ditch just above the horizon. The moon was like a gob of spit, and Rosario was saying, Señora, what a terrible tragedy. Palma, 1978. What a story. It's such a good story. So it's really interesting because it's a, what do you call it? An anticipation of the the real estate crisis in Mallorca. But anyway, we want to hear your story now.
I need to borrow your comment.
Okay.
So my,
Towards the middle.
I'm the very first one.
Oh, you're the first one. Got it.
It's good. So this is,
Oh, use the mic. She's got it.
oh, Kelly, so many options. So this is also a very unhappy woman. But I'm not going to read the whole thing. And this was co-translated with Julia Sanchez. It's by Mònica Batet, and the title is Tromsa, Tromsa, Tromso. Sometimes this is my story, others it's not. They used to bring it up at home whenever the room fell silent. They'd talk about her, about a city with a strange name, Sokoyosko. They talk about that evening. There are still pages and pages with tracings of her hands sitting in a drawer. Some are just of hands, while others have words written on the palms or along the fingers. Run away, get out, air, air, disappear. Now and then, I place my hand in one of the outlines to see if we have this one thing in common. If maybe I too will see all those people someday. They say she used to lie down before supper, that she could have spent her whole life in bed without ever looking around her. This is when she noticed it, getting bigger by the day. She felt it right in her stomach. First, it was a river pebble, then one of those rocks that farmers use as markers. Finally, a vast, rocky cliff face that somehow grew out of her and filled the whole room. The landscape changed. All was light and air. She started walking with a sure step. My eyes are terrible. It is a small print. Let's see if this helps a little. Beneath her feet, the whisper of the sea. She shut her eyes and let that unfamiliar world envelop her until my grandfather knocked on the door and the entire landscape vanished. But that was only at the start. He'd misled her. She kept saying so. She said so to her mother-in-law and to a friend when she could get her on the phone. Long before she ever said yes, he told her, "It's very green there. The trees come in different shades, and sometimes it feels like they're fighting for room." Even though this wasn't technically a lie, the shades of green did vary from dark to so pale it was almost yellow, and there were trees everywhere you looked. That was it. There were no streets, no people to talk to, just a trail that led to a forest of towering pines. It was a 5-kilometer trek to the nearest town and another 5 back. Her mother-in-law always said, "The forest behind the house is bigger than that city you're from. All you have to do is follow the path. Don't go down there, or people will talk." She tried walking in those woods her first few weeks there, eyes trained on the dusty reddish ground, and felt that she probably couldn't do it. The voices came to her after the first trees. Though she couldn't make out a single word, the melody was pleasant. It was like a choir of women and men singing in a language that she did not speak. At first, it made her feel less alone, but later, as she walked on, the lilting sounds morphed into ever more frightening screams, and she had to crouch and cover her ears. Then the ivy shot up, and closed in on her, snake-like, twisting around her feet and ankles. There always came a point when she could make them stop. She'd walk as fast as she could until the screams weren't even so much as a distant murmur. Her forehead burning hot, strands of hair plastered against her face, and her mother-in-law demanding the minute she saw her enter the house, "And what have you been up to this whole time?" She never had any idea what to say and struggled to hide the bewilderment in her eyes because she knew her mother-in-law would nag my grandfather. "Why'd you bring a city girl here? What did you see in her? I don't get it." It was always the same, and he never answered, probably because that kind of question required too many words. Sometime after it all started, my grandmother gave up on the forest and went down there instead. Just 8 streets and a square with the same 3 women sitting on the same bench, day in, day out. Sometimes she talked with them. "Yes, my mother-in-law's doing just fine, thank you." "You're right, There aren't as many trees in the city, and we don't eat as well. Sure, the war felt closer probably, but I was really young when it all happened. I remember so little. Yes, I guess too noisy and too crowded. No, I don't find it scary to come down here on my own. And no, my husband doesn't mind. Yes, of course, I like living up there. I'm so lucky my cousins introduced me to join. Bye now, have a nice afternoon. She bid them farewell with a smile, certain that there were 3 women who would remark to each other as soon as she walked away. Such a city girl. Antònia's son let himself be swept off his feet. That's the only explanation. I don't believe a word when she says it's all peaches and cream in that house. And they were right not to believe her. If only they knew she heard the choir of faraway voices whenever she stopped to answer their questions. If only they knew that 2 days earlier, as she strolled along one of the few streets down there, ivy had sprung from the rooftops of each and every house and blanketed the walls before she could blink. If only they'd seen her run so the creeping ivy wouldn't have a chance to coil around her neck, wrists, arms. Sometimes, as she was nearing the farmhouse, she sensed the voices right behind her. Drawn to that song she couldn't understand, she'd come to a stop because the oddness of that situation held a freedom of sorts. She'd count 20, 21, all the way to 50 before turning around. The possibilities she imagined were so great, yet all she saw when she turned was the steep trail strewn with uneven rocks. Her mother-in-law would ask her to help with supper, and she'd shut herself in her room, hoping to feel the cliff and the sea beneath her feet once more, even though she hadn't for so long. Months after it all started, she fell pregnant with my mother. That's when the singing voices stopped. Whenever she went down there, she'd constantly eye the air above her, waiting for the ivy to tumble down, but it never did. Maybe it's all over, she thought, and often she wondered if things really had to end this way. Endings, she'd always heard say, ought to be clear-cut. A door slamming so loudly it could be heard on another continent, a scream that's been forming inside someone for years. Eventually, she convinced herself that maybe some endings were meant to be quiet. The next few years were unremarkable, until one day, as she was watching my mother play, she pushed down on her belly and realized she could make out a tiny river pebble. She didn't want to go back to the place she'd left behind. This is when she began to worry that what she thought of as an ending was just a lull. She didn't want to make a fuss about it, but the pebble seemed to be growing, bit by bit, every single day. A few years after it all started, my grandmother took to locking herself in her bedroom again, even when my mother called for her from the other side of the door. Evening after evening, she waited for the cliff, because the pebble was still there, and it was still growing. Every afternoon, she took my mother on walks, holding her by the hand, hoping to hear that choir. Even so, none of it came back. To pass the days before the inevitable, she furtively traced the outline of her hands after lunch. Run away, get out, air, disappear. And just when it seemed the inevitable wouldn't happen, on a quiet evening of staring at the ceiling and waiting, she saw her. They say my grandmother was lying in bed, as usual, and as usual running 2 fingers over her pebble. The room spun so fast, everything was a blur. She shut her eyes to settle the vertigo, and when she opened them, a woman with long red hair was perched on a corner of the bed. She sat up, and the foreign woman beckoned her to follow. And you gotta look it up to know what happened.
I will briefly say that all of the pieces that appear in the print magazine are available online for free, no subscription, no firewall, I know. This magazine does so many wonderful things, so you can finish the story there.
But it's so beautiful.
They are really beautiful.
When I said exquisite, I also meant the covers.
They are. Our design is really wonderful.
The design is fantastic.
Yeah, they're all very, they're very cohesive, I think, the aesthetic.
It's a real style, yes.
I would love for the two of you, I think, to kind of combine the first couple questions that we talked about. How did you come to the authors? And maybe in conjunction with that, what you really love about Catalan literature right now, or maybe something you don't love about it, that could be fun too. I think there's interesting ways to think about those kinds of questions. But why these authors, why these women authors, and what drew you to the text?
I have to confess that I was invited to translate and to read the stories and to choose somebody to translate. So, in fact, the Common introduced me to this story by Antònia Vicenç, and I thought it was so compelling and fantastic. That I was thrilled. And the other thing I chose to translate was to Los Miquel, and I had translated her before. She's a poet. But it's very interesting because there is this strain of insatisfaction in Catalan when the characters the Catalan women writers write about, which is why I think I titled the session "Frustration, Rage, Compassion." And it's a very interesting thing because it starts in the 20th century. For example, you can read Víctor Català, who took a male pseudonym because she won a poetry contest at Jocs Florals as a very young woman, and they didn't give her the prize because she was a woman. So, there you go. So she became Víctor Català, and her first novel, I'm blanking on the title. Oh, it's interesting because it's called the ruralist novel, and it's about women who live in the countryside. Solitude. Thank you, solitude, and. Anyway, it's all of the horrible things that happen to a country woman, who is being oppressed by the men around her, and there are rapes, and so there's a strain. And then you have Mercè Rodoreda, who is one of the great 20th century novelists, who also her most well-known character, Colometa in the La Plaza del Diamant, which is translated alternatively as the Time of the Doves or in Diamond Square, is also a woman who's satisfied sexually but absolutely horrified by her husband.
So husbands are a running theme.
It's a strain. Yes. I don't know if this is something you feel, but when I read your story, the story you translated, and when I translated this, I mean this theme of insatisfaction. Of course, Antònia Vicenç writes that in the 80s, so in 1978. So there's the kind of post-Francoist thing. When you said you don't feel sympathetic to the woman in the story,
I'm not unsympathetic to her necessarily. I think because of the cadence of the way it's written, that I think you did really well. I think I would love for you to read audiobooks to me. I think you're really great in that space. But there's no quotations. There's no indication of speaker. When Rosario speaks, it's in italics. That's only in a few moments. There's just this lilting, and it's just this urging forward. And I just feel this car with the brakes, and I'm going, and I'm just waiting for her to get there. And it's not that the husband doesn't seem irritating. I'm sure that he is.
That's a kind word.
But maybe on a kind of linguistic level, but philosophical, make a choice about your life, make a change, and the change was to push him off, which was very satisfying. Speaking of insatisfaction, a lot of satisfaction there. I absolutely chuckled at the end, but I think I'm always in that grip of authorial voice and authorial intention and what they're doing with their characters. And I thought she could have made another decision if she wanted.
she could.
The author or the character?
The character.
The character. Yeah, me too. It's like get out.
But wait a second. But what she's doing, she's this is a man whose empire is about to fall apart, and he in a sense he desires to be,
he wants someone to get him out. So she's actually satisfying.
I think
without
so.
the air, but this other way.
No air, but.
But also,
Or lots of error?
let's not forget, 1978 was 3 years after the death of Franco.
Franco.
So I was actually surprised that it was so early. When I read it, but I did not notice the date, and that's very early, and so there was no divorce yet.
Sure.
It was maybe 1982 when you could, because if you had everything was a Catholic marriage, and so if you separated, you had to do apostasis of faith. Which is like, okay, so you're going to go to hell because you've made the wrong decision, and you can. The Catholic Church will do it, but it's
Because, you know, and I think we talked about Spanish yesterday in the Latin American writers. They were talking about the Baroqueness of Spanish. And one of the interesting things about Catalan, and it does have to do indeed with its not having been spoken or with its being repressed and all of that, is that I think Spanish has become calcified. You know, a lot of times when I read Peninsula writers, I know what the next word is going to be. Not so much in Latin America, there's a lot more breaking of the molds, but in Catalan, you don't have that feeling, you know, because it hasn't, in fact, it was sort of on a shelf. And it didn't, there hasn't been a Catalan academy in fact, in the early 20th century, there was there's a normalization of the language, and because people had forgotten how to write it and how to speak it, and, you know, so it was full of barbarisms, and so there is a correctness, but it actually hasn't repressed the language. It hasn't boxed it in. You don't think?
Oh.
The writing, the literature, I mean, not spoken.
I don't know, but I do know that you know, I listen to a podcast that they talk a lot about how la normalización is, you know, it kills, you know, the delta, you know, different.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Everything, tothom is con Barcelona.
No, but yeah. Well, no.
But Diek is Barcelona.
Right, but when in the writing,
they do not say that, but I mean I hear them saying this. The authors and and, you know, Jaume Pons Alorda was one of them, and he was all the time speaking in Mallorquí, but it is that there is, and this is one of the problems I think of any regularization of language. Is like, you read in oh God, my head, it's not, what is it, in the Lost Girls, the Italian don't speak in dialect, Italian,
sure,
right?
Sure.
And Elena Ferrante, right? And it just, so much is lost when you culturize something or normalize something. Now,
well, and AI is definitely going to push us in that direction,
but I think for me, the calcification of language, or for me, the biggest difference between Spanish and Catalan, for me, as, again, scientists, what do I know? I mean, do not listen to her, but is that Spanish can be so incredibly convoluted and formal.
And Baroque, that Baroqueness.
And Baroque. And Catalan is much more direct. Much more direct. There's a lot of ambiguity, like any Romance language. You know, it's like no subject. Who is the subject of this really exciting verb? I mean, who kissed who? Who kissed what?
Right,
you know?
right.
But it is, and also the direct object can be somewhere else, and so it's like, especially in poetry, right? I mean, it's like, whoa, this is hard to interpret, and lovely, and unexpected.
Yeah.
And we can't translate it.
The other day I have an example of that. I was translating Angels Grigori, and she had a poem that was, there was no gendered subject. And I had to give it a gender in English. It had to be he or she, and so I wrote to her and I said, there's no gender here. Do you want a gender? Or should I use, thank goodness, now we have they, right? She said, I prefer not to have a gender, but whatever you decide. So I used they. Yes. Yeah. But yes, it's true. There are all of those are some of the exciting ambiguities. Yeah.
Very much so, yes. I translate a young poet called Greta Sibling, and that's her pen name. But she had a poem where we went for a long time, and I ended up using a very indirect, I think I ended up using an indirect, or we ended up gendering it. I'm not quite sure, but we talked about many different options. But to not use they, and to what to do.
There was no way to do this without a they, because it was all, every sentence began with the person, so, yeah.
Are there any questions from the audience about features of translation in general or specific to these works? Yeah?
Well, I can.
You can be loud.
You can shout.
No, it's more of a reflection because you mentioned that this strain of female unsatisfaction in Catalan literature. But at the same time, female writers have been mainstream and bestsellers in Catalonia for as far as we can go back. You mentioned Marcelo Loreda or Ramon, which was not only female but feminist, but at the same time mainstream, and it appealed to both men and women readers, right? So it's a female insatisfaction that it's very easy to empathize as a man. Why? This is my reflection because.
Why the, I keep saying insatisfaction, and that isn't a word in English, is it?
No, but I thought you were intentional, that you were not saying dissatisfaction.
It was hard for me to say dissatisfaction because it's more, anyway. But what are you asking, why do men like to read this literature, or why in
Catalonia women writers have been best-selling to this day, talking about from a feminine perspective, and they are some of the best-selling books and appeal to everyone.
Because they're the best books.
Just because they're really good. I mean, Garcia Marquez said that the Plaza del Diamant was, he said that was one of the great 20th century novels. So, I think it's in praise of Catalan men. They appreciate the excellence of the female writers. That there's no, but I don't know.
I actually thought you were going to ask, why are they unsatisfied?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, because it's like you could be a successful writer, but not all women are being. Yeah.
But I get it. We somehow when I read these novels, I feel connected with this insatisfaction. So it's not only a feminine insatisfaction. It's a social kind of struggle.
I really do think that's the core of it. That the women are expressing a kind of yearning and frustration that men in Catalan society also feel. And part of it is probably,
Yeah, I mean, identities cross so many different kinds of rivers, but I mean, to the point, I wasn't as empathetic with the female character as maybe other people were, and it's just because the writing was encapsulating in a particular way for me, right? You don't know how you're going to identify with something. It reminded me of that very famous book by Chris, The Midwives. Do we know this? Yes, thank you. Yes, Armenian American writer. He writes about women, he writes about giving birth, he writes about midwives, and he's not experienced any of that. And I was in a reading once where the women in the audience were both with a lot of admiration and frustration, couldn't understand how he could possibly know this space so well. He's just really good at it. Yeah.
Do you want to go? I don't know how. We should wrap
8.
up. Yeah. Okay.
No, we can.
I was going to tell one anecdote about a piece of something that was difficult.
Yeah. Oh.
There was at the end of the story, page 12, right? It says the clouds formed a kind of ditch, and she used a Mallorcan word. And I wrote to a Mallorcan novelist, Sebastián Zamora, and I said, what do you think she's saying? Because it was, you know, the dark sky when she's about to push her husband off the balcony. And he said, I have no idea. And he said, but I think ditch, I think that's good. And the next night I went up to my roof. I have a nice view from my roof, and I was looking at the sky, and there was a cloud that looked, like a tunnel. And I thought, it's the ditch. And I took a photograph of it, and I sent it to Sebastián and said, whoa. Anyway, that's life corroborating translation.
Life experience.
Yes, life.
Anything you want to share to the same effect?
Mine is not so much a word, but you already pointed it out that in both of these, there are no, the way dialogue is presented in the spoken voice. And one of my problems is that I write, and I actually did something kind of similar to what she does in this one. And what I did is I separated sentences with commas, and I put a period for each what was a sentence, because it bothered me to not be able to tell. And Julia said, no, I think we need to be close to this. And I'm like, okay, Julia, yes. But now I think I would have pushed back, because when trying to read it out loud, it's like, this is hard to understand. I mean, and so I think I would, but again, this is style, and I don't think it's typical to have multiple sentences separated by periods. I wouldn't say, oh, all Catalan authors do it. She does do it in the novel also, so it might be her particular style, and I respect that. But I think it would be very hard for English readers. Now we have our rules, and they're very specific, and other languages do it very, very, very differently. And I think it's very healthy for English readers to see different ways of doing it. But scientists, I like clarity. Like you may want to understand it differently, but I want you to know what's happening in the syntax. And I was going to say,
you can do that with rhythm.
That story does it very well. Yeah, the prosodic elements are very well tailored in yours.
I don't think it's clear to me. And I read it out loud in both languages. Multiple times, and again, sometimes maybe I just don't hear it, but it was. I think it's hard to make that clear. If I read it out loud, you guys are going to know what's going on. But if you're on the page, you don't necessarily.
And you don't hear it in your head when.
And not if it's the first time I'm reading it.
Maybe we drink beers outside and continue this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you for coming. This was really